Our next presenter is Dr. Henry Neave. Dr. Neave is the Director of Education and Research of the British Deming Association, an association which was formed in 1987 through Dr. Neave's inspiration. Dr. Neave is also a member of the Statistics Group in the Department of Mathematics at the University of Nottingham in England. Dr. Neave first began with Dr. Deming's approach in 1981 through his appointment as Statistical Quality Consultant to the British subsidiaries of the Nashua Corporation. He has assisted at all of Dr. Deming's 4-day seminars in Britain, which have been presented annually from 1985. Dr. Neave today will talk about appreciation for a system. This title is borrowed from the first part of Dr. Deming's recent writings on profound knowledge. Dr. Neave will also be discussing some of the structure and work of the British Deming Association. If you hadn't had a chance to read The Deming Dimension, last year's hot quality book, I highly recommend it to you. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Dr. Henry R. Neave.
As with Peter, this talk is a somewhat abbreviated version of what appears in the write-up. I see from the program that I'm supposed to get finished for something called a 7th inning stretch. I trust that I'm not supposed to know what that means. Maybe it comes from a similar source to the letter which was waiting for me in my hotel room yesterday from the OQPF, talking about something about breaking a leg. I found it kind of inconvenient. Anyway, I hope that the language barrier won't be too difficult. Well, it is, of course, a great honor and pleasure to be invited to address this supreme conference, especially to appear on this first day alongside Dr. Deming and my other three great and respected friends, Bill and Peter and Mike Vitey, still to come. In spite of being based in Britain, I have actually managed to be here at this conference on all but one occasion, and I did in fact speak at the very first conference 4 years ago. As I recall, I was then doing a parallel session, and I was in parallel, coincidentally, with our previous two speakers. I had Peter Schultes on one side of me talking on performance appraisal, Bill Schirkenbach on the other side talking about QFD. So as you can guess, I didn't really stand much of a chance, and I think without doubt I established the record for the smallest ever attendance at anything at any one of these 5 conferences. I have to confess that I always feel a little insecure speaking on this side of the Atlantic. I'm very well aware that not only most of the speakers, but probably a high proportion of the delegates have been involved with Dr. Deming's approach in various ways, probably for maybe as long as I have, if not longer, and probably far more effectively in most cases. So when the invitation came for me to speak here, it was something of a puzzle to try and fathom out what I ought to speak about, which you might not know too much about already. Well, one fairly obvious kind of answer soon came. I could talk about the British Deming Association. Pretty good chance that most of you don't know too much about that. And in fact, that's what I initially intended to do, and I should have told John that in fact that's not really what's going to happen. But I did start on planning that. I started to write down all of the things which I could tell you about the BDA, the fact that it's a not-for-profit organization, about its research committee, its regional groups, its seminar program, its publications, its educational program for consultants, its alliance of consultants, its current efforts to try and stimulate some initial interest in some big areas like education and health and the city and politics. And you will find some summary of such information in the write-up which I've prepared. If there's any time at the end of this session, I'll be happy to elaborate a little on some of those things. I don't think it'll work out that way, but I will be at the networking session later on in the afternoon if any of you, especially those of you with any contacts in Britain, would like to get any information from me. However, I soon realized that for the purpose of this session, What was really more important was not the detail of the BDA, but the concept underlying the association. Because I think a really important characteristic of it as a whole is that it was conceived as and mostly operates as a system for the promulgation and deepening understanding of the Deming philosophy. These were, in fact, its stated aims when we came into existence at the end of 1987, along with, well, the aim of being able to help in any ways that we could, both individuals and organizations that started getting interested. There's a more recent and much more detailed mission and aims statement. Don't look at it now. It's at the last couple of pages in my write-up if you want to look at it later. The concept of the BDA being a system is what, I guess, led us to set it up as a national organization. It was interesting hearing about how the OQPF got founded, again, just like us, with a small number of enthusiasts. And in fact, when we thought about calling ourselves the British Deming Association, it really did seem an exceedingly ambitious kind of title to choose. But there have been big advantages in that when any new initiatives have come along, we've been able to regard them as new components in the same system, with all the advantages of having coordinated aims and all of the help and support between the various components as things develop. And the boundaries of the system may grow. There is already a French Deming Association, and there are some other European possibilities in the pipeline also. And obviously we shall do whatever we can to foster close working relationships between such European groups. In this country, I guess there isn't anything exactly similar to this. There are, of course, many excellent Deming users groups, especially the OQPF. There's also, so I have heard, some kind of club of so-called Deming consulting organizations, and I was kind of excited when I first heard about that. But I confess I've been a little bit disappointed about some of the things that I've heard about it since. On the other hand, I've been recently very pleased when I was over in Newport Beach 2 weeks ago to hear of some considerable interest there of combining together and coordinating some of the work of the various Deming users groups on that side of the country, and I really think that would be good to see. Anyway, the perception of the BDA as a system led to my idea then of basing this presentation on the concept of systems, the initial intention being to incorporate into it both the system concept of the Deming philosophy and also provides some information about the Deming Association. Well, so most of the latter, apart from what I've said already, I've had to cut out because of time. But as I say, it is there in the write-up if you'd like to look at it. Now, I make no claim whatsoever of being an expert on systems thinking. Maybe, however, that's no bad thing. Do you remember that in the system of profound knowledge, Dr. Deming points out that one need not be eminent in any part of profound knowledge in order to understand it and to apply it? I think I'd go further. I think there can be disadvantages to being eminent. I mean, I'm personally well aware that my eminence, if you like to call it that, speciality, career in statistics, most definitely held me back from really listening and hearing what Dr. Deming was saying about statistical theory and practice. First-class honors mathematician, PhD, all this kind of stuff. What I first heard from Dr. Deming, I mean, it just seemed as if I had nothing to learn. Well, obviously, I was so wrong. And I know a lot of other statisticians who are in the same situation. And I would guess that the same is true, and I've got some evidence that it's true, of experts in psychology and in systems thinking as well. Let me try to sketch for you what I hope I'll be able to get through during the remaining just under an hour, which I have available. I would like, first of all, to tell you how I first came to view the Deming philosophy as a system, and to show you a technique which I now use in my teaching at home to try and nurture appreciation of that kind of thinking rather more quickly than it came to me. I guess I should very briefly review the main concepts of what a system is, but as I expected, after seeing who the speakers were that were going to precede me today, I certainly don't need to say very much about that, so that will be exceedingly brief. I'd then like to move into why I think many people do not think in system terms. Talk about some of the difficulties and obstacles in the way of so doing. Then, I have a couple of personal examples which I'd like to talk to you about how a cooperation win-win outlook has contributed significantly, I think, to optimizing systems that I have personally been working in. And then finally, I'd like to talk about how thinking in terms of optimizing systems helps certainly to break through some of the apparent contradictions and paradoxes which I have certainly seen in the past in Dr. Deming's teachings, and I think a lot of other people still see in relating the Deming philosophy to things that actually happen and the things which they're familiar with. So let me go back to just under 5 years ago, when I first had the temerity to stand up in public and make some kind of introductory presentation on Dr. Deming's teachings. As I said, I'm still pretty new at this, and I'm very conscious of it. It was sometime in September 1986 that I first said anything in public. And what I did on those first 2 or 3 presentations, after a couple of minutes introduction, I would barge into the 14 points. Point number 1 would go up on the screen, and I'd talk about point number 1 for 5 or 10 minutes. And then I'd put point number 2 on the screen, and I'd natter on about that for 5 or 10 minutes. And then point number 3 and point number 4. Even as I'm just describing it, 14 is already beginning to seem a rather large number, not only to the delegates, but to the speaker as well. And it also, that kind of approach, as you can guess, didn't really prepare me very well for fielding questions on points 11 and 12 in particular. Well, maybe what I was doing wasn't too bad. I didn't receive many complaints, but how would they know? And it was largely people that I met through those early presentations that helped me to form the BDA about a year later. However, improvement was obviously eminently desirable. I was fortunate enough very quickly then to come across the joiner triangle. And I started using that quite considerably in my introductory presentations. Because it soon occurred to me that the 3 vertices of the joiner triangle form some very fundamental principles upon which it is possible to build the 14 points. All 3 vertices of the joiner triangle are worthy of deep discussion, and I have found that it really is possible for all but the real diehards to make some significant progress during such discussions. Now, obviously, with the benefit of more recent wisdom, maybe I should have had the concept of system and optimization of a system more directly featured in the fundamental principles which I was using. However, I do include these concepts, and of course the famous diagram, which we're all very familiar with, essentially as a way to bring the 3 vertices together. One might now regard that as kind of the wrong way round. But, as I shall argue later, I think there are many viable routes for the early parts of any journey, and the same is surely true of the journey of learning about the Deming philosophy. The way in which this joiner triangle I found to be useful was simply this, that if the fundamental principles in the joiner triangle can be accepted by the people that we're talking to, if they can be argued and accepted, and then the 14 points can be seen as logical consequences of them, then how can the validity of the 14 points, all of them, be questioned? And I found that a pretty effective way of getting over exactly what Peter was just saying. The people that say, well, yes, I can go along with 10 of the 14 points, or maybe 13 of them. And who knows which was the one which was missing. The argument is really similar, I guess, to what you get in any branch of mathematics. where you have basic principles plus logic. But there's one important difference. In maths, especially pure mathematics, there seems to be no real interest in whether or not the fundamentals and the operations, the axioms, really mean anything very much in the real world. Well, here, of course, the validity of the foundations is of the absolute utmost importance. I suppose I could say that what I was attempting to do in my small way back then was perhaps a very minor precursor of what we heard this morning from Dr. Deming. The 14 points for management in industry, education, and government follow naturally as application of the system of profound knowledge. I'm certainly not claiming that I was thinking quite then in terms of profound knowledge, but I think by linking each of the 14 points together and the deadly diseases with the three foundations in the joiner triangle, and hence with each other, I was making some kind of minimal start on appreciating and teaching these highly important components of the Deming philosophy as components of a system. So I'd learnt a lesson. I'd learnt a lesson which was not learnt by our Department of Trade and Industry, which I'd like to just tell you about. Department of Trade and Industry somehow or other asked me to write an introductory booklet on the Deming philosophy. I don't quite know how that happened because the DTI has an official policy not to do anything for one particular guru. It has to be across the board. And I think, obviously, I had some unknown friend in there who just sort of slipped this through. Anyway, I wrote this thing, and the proofs were sent to me. They're actually about the worst set of proofs I've ever received for anything. That's by the way. And after 2 or 3 turnarounds, the thing was published. The one thing I hadn't seen was the cover design. Let me read to you, first of all, just 4 lines from what I had in part of the content of the book. A few words of warning before embarking on the 14 points. The points do not constitute the whole of the Deming philosophy. They are just particular important constituents of it. They are not a straightforward, well-defined list of instructions. They are not techniques. They are not a checklist. They are not a checklist. Without a word of a lie, this is the cover which came out on that little booklet. I still use the joiner triangle in my introductory teaching. Well, we've got a little bit further since then. Let me just give you one further thing which we do to try to develop this kind of understanding at a very early stage. I want to show you a little technique which I use in the BDA's public seminar series of educational seminars after about the first 3 days. It's what I call a matrix example. It's a very simple idea, very simple, and it goes as follows. The matrix, now this is small print, it's on page 8 in the handout if you need it, but I can tell you what's there. Down the left-hand column, we have the 14 points and the deadly diseases. Along the top, we have some foundations. The first 3 are the joiner triangle vertices. The next 3 are what I tend to call the new climate. Join, work, innovation, rather than just improvement and cooperation, win-win. And then the 2 more recent emphases of optimization rather than sub-optimization, and intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. And quite simply what I do with this, with the group of people that I'm teaching, is I split up the matrix, essentially divide the number of delegates. This is designed for fairly small groups of 10, 20, 30, that kind of number. Split the table up into chunks, allocate them to pairs around the room, and they get people talking in their pairs initially about what they see as the links between the foundations and the 14 points and deadly diseases. And to put in a single plus if they see a reasonably positive correlation, a couple of pluses if it's a very strong one, and similarly minuses if it's the other way around. And then when each pair has dealt with its chunk of the table, I then get 2 pairs together to look at what each other have been doing, and immediately focusing in on it for points of discussion on things where one pair cannot understand the reasons for some of the entries of the other pair, and then build the whole thing up And what you can then do, especially if you put the answers onto overheads, is you can combine them all together and then sort of see at a glance the way in which the discussion has moved around the room. And there's all sorts of, it's a very simple tool, but it seems to be quite effective. It focuses discussion on some of the most difficult issues. It certainly focuses things on things which I haven't taught very well. And also, it could be used perhaps at a subsequent time, and then hopefully one might see a rather bigger chunk of pluses at the top and a bigger chunk of minuses at the bottom. This actually came from the last time that I used this, just about a couple of weeks before I came over here last month. And that's the actual feedback which we got from that group. So nothing very profound, nothing very difficult in that, but I've found it a very useful thing because what it's also doing is all the time, whatever kind of discussion is going on, it's linking all these things together in people's minds, which is, of course, consolidating the notion of the Deming philosophy as a system. And that is really what I'm concerned with doing. Okay. Well, as I said, I shan't need to say anything very much to you about the basic essentials of what processes and systems are, so I will simply content myself with just a very few words showing you one or two mostly familiar pictures, and that will then sort of set the scene for the rest of what I want to do. If we're talking about a process, first of all, well, there's a diagram. We've seen it in a certain form in Bill's presentation. A process, of course, inputs are anything which affect the process, outputs are anything which are affected by the process. And the big point to emphasize, I think, is that usually whatever process or job, whatever one is talking about, you usually get far more inputs and far more outputs than anybody initially ever realizes until you start thinking about it. If we move into the concept of system, just before we get to Dr. Deming's definition, there's one which I found in Concise Oxford Dictionary, which actually fits rather well, I think, with the understanding which we have of system. And there, almost word for word, of course, is the way in which Dr. Deming defined it for us this morning. In that definition, I think the two important things are components working together and the aim of a system. And let me just spend a very brief amount of time on each of those two things, again as foundation of what I want to say after. The notion of components of a system working together are beautifully seen in a number of pictures, probably all familiar to you. There's one we haven't seen today. It comes from Joiner Associates. Joiner Associates, a flowchart of an organization. And although you've seen this already today, I want to show it to you again because I just think this is so nice. And that, of course, is from Bill Schirkenbach's presentation this morning. Also, of course, the third picture, which is highly relevant, talking about a system, again, is our production viewed as a system. Picture from Dr. Deming's work way back, 1950, in Japan. And of course, the whole notion of beginning to think of everything on the horizontal, rather than the old familiar vertical pyramid scheme, is so crucial, so fundamental to everything that we're doing. We haven't actually seen a picture, well, we have seen a sort of a picture of the vertical pyramid thing today, but we haven't seen this one. And if you haven't, I love that picture. I don't know about you. It comes from the Mans Foundation in Holland. It's rather nice, rather nice. Now, the opposite to a system, of course, is what happens when you chop the system up. And I won't put this up. Dr. Deming's done it for us already, suggested to him by Neave. If we take his production viewed as a system diagram, put circles around all the different components in it, you immediately destroy the system, you're right into sub-optimization of the system, and that is the whole big danger which he's trying to teach us to guard against. I think that perhaps everything which Dr. Deming calls a faulty practice is, in some form or other, an example of sub-optimization. And sub-optimization of subsystems almost invariably is an obstruction to optimization of the whole system. Sub-optimization is virtually analogous to competition win-lose, while optimization is, of course, cooperation win-win, which some time ago is what I started referring to as the backbone of the Deming philosophy. So that's working together. How about aim? Well, I think if we're going to talk about aim, again, I can really do no better than to simply refer us to some of Dr. Deming's writings. Within the system of profound knowledge, he tells us that the aim is a value judgment, and then, in describing that, he tells us that there are no theorems from which to derive the aim, and he proposes an aim for everybody to gain over the long term. Well, you could hardly expect it in the short term, so I think that's fair enough. Now, I find that some people, when they see that, everybody to gain, tend to say, oh, come on, this is just fairy tale. The world can't be like that. But, you know, if the only way we can achieve an aim, that we can achieve optimization, is, as we surely know, if we can have people cooperating in a totally win-win kind of environment. And how on earth can you expect people to cooperate if the aim is anything significantly different from what we have there in that third quote? Let me just particularize these concepts of working together and of aim to the system of profound knowledge itself. Dr. Deming, to the best of my knowledge, didn't use the term profound knowledge, at least it's not in Out of the Crisis, until about 1987. And I didn't hear him talk about the system of profound knowledge until about a couple of years later. And that was a hugely important transition, because what we were getting previously to that were, as it were, an ever-increasing list of components, but without the focus on the way in which they all link together. And that is the crucial thing. And so that's where we were, I think, somewhere at about the autumn of 1989. How about the aim of the system of profound knowledge? Well, Dr. Deming's defined that for us this morning. Better quality of life for everyone. Very closely linked to the aim which we just saw in the third of those quotes, which I put up. But there's something which he has very recently added at the beginning of chapter 4, on the system of profound knowledge, which I've actually found quite fascinating. This may be just me, but let me just talk about that. There is in any journey an origin and a destination. The origin is the present style of management. Destination is transformation. Those last four words have fascinated me. I could have talked to Dr. Deming about it, but I've chosen not to for rather good reason for the moment. Because I see a possible double meaning in those last few words. I mean, certainly if we had a vision of where we need to get to compared with where we are now, that would surely be a transformation from where we are now. And that, I guess, is the more obvious interpretation of those words. But the words could also be read as implying that the aim, the destination, is a state of continuing transformation. And to me, I think that perhaps more far-reaching interpretation seems the more appropriate one. Because I've had the chance just a couple of days ago, I could have asked Dr. Deming about this. I preferred not to for the moment, because I'm keeping in mind his recent frequent reminders that, have you heard this? The question is more important than the answer. And I think to consider, to think about and discuss this type of question is perhaps in some ways more important than knowing exactly what he was thinking about when he initially wrote those words. Okay, so there's the basic concepts of process and system in particular. But as we know, although it's been adopted Deming's teachings for a long while, most people in this world most certainly don't think in terms of systems. And I think we need to just think a little bit as to why that's so, because unless we understand why that's so, we're not really going to be in a position to help them to develop some understanding. Well, I suppose first, thinking in terms of systems is hard. It's difficult. That's a good reason why many people don't do it. If we're in a situation where time is of the essence, thinking of things in isolation rather than in terms of components of a system is much quicker. Also, particularly in the case of somebody who hasn't received a very good education, thinking of things in isolation is easier. Now, poor education and lack of time are both pretty widespread, certainly in my country. And from a government's point of view, with an election coming up, as we have, it's pretty attractive to sub-optimize, since the messages supporting and explaining a sub-optimization are quicker and easier to get over to the electorate, especially if that electorate is busy and or poorly educated. In terms of the system of profound knowledge, I think there's an additional difficulty. I guess people are used to being pretty much baffled by statistics and psychology, often through bad teaching, sure. And I guess to a lot of people, theory of knowledge just sounds so hopelessly academic that they're not really just even going to try and get involved with that for the time being. But common notions of scientific method, I think, create the delusion that system thinking is the opposite of what it actually is. I mean, scientific method so often seems to be, well, implicitly, if not explicitly, regarded as breaking down a system into its simplest parts and studying them in isolation. Exactly, diametrically the opposite of what we need to do. Concentrating on purely mathematical approaches is almost bound to constitute a similar barrier to progress. By its nature, a purely mathematical approach has to simplify. It has to convert real problems into problems, quote, which are capable of solution. I've actually seen that in maths books. Another difficulty. Systems themselves, we've seen a picture of systems. But of course, systems themselves, if we've got a complicated structure within a system, then there's an even more complicated structure between and within systems. Something which goes back a long way to the mid-50s at least is the notion of hierarchies of systems. There's one which comes from a paper by Kenneth Boulding from about 35 years ago. No need to look in great detail at that. The sense of it is obvious. We are going down the list into increasing complexity, and by and large, every kind of system which we have there fully contains things of a level higher up the slide. Because it's even worse than that. Even within a category, there's going to be yet more hierarchy. In the human category, we've got a person who's within a group, who's within a division, which is within a company. The company itself has other systems, governmental, financial, cultural, within which it lies. And it has strong connections with others, even if not within them, like the education system. And this really complicates issues enormously. Something which is obviously predominant in that kind of thinking at a very high level, of course, is politics, government. And I've got a chunk in the paper which I've headed Political Sub-Optimization. Let me think about this a little bit. Government and politics, as you know as well as I do, can be one huge obstacle to progress. For a start, politics is almost universally regarded in the Western world as a battle between the parties. Hardly surprising then, I guess, that governments seem to perceive society in terms of a system of competition. And it certainly is a self-generating system. If that's the way that people are thinking, it will generate yet more and more competition and conflict. So similarly, it's not surprising that the emphasis in government is more on dividing up the pie rather than baking a bigger pie. Because how can government sort of bake a bigger electorate? You know, it doesn't quite fit into the bill. Again, when an election is coming up, as we have. Certainly in Britain, now I don't know too much about American politics, but certainly in Britain, the opposition's job is most definitely seen as being to oppose. And you, I guess, now know that better than you probably did a year or so ago, because it is with some embarrassment that it's come to my attention that you now see on your television screenings of our House of Commons question time quite regularly. So I guess you'll know what I mean. And those of you who sort of thought that all British people were all sort of upright and polite and full of reserve and all that kind of thing have now probably changed your mind a bit. And indeed, if an opposition party does not oppose, then they actually get mocked by the media and, of course, by the opposite party as well. Basically, oh, you're not criticizing something which we're doing, then we must be right. And there's kudos out of that. So there you have, again, a system of competition. You've almost got to compete and be in conflict, or else you lose face. Now, as I said, I don't know much about American politics, but there's something which I do remember, one particular occasion which made an impact on me. And all right, it might have just been an unusual case, but it actually happened. I was over here when the Irangate affair blew up, and the president went on nationwide television to give all the explanations and apologies and whatever. And on the channel which I was watching, a person from the opposite party, is it Democrat or Democratic? I don't even know very much about that, but you know what I mean. The president was followed by a Democrat. And of course, I sat back fully expecting what would have happened in Britain if, say, Neil Kinnock had been following up on Margaret Thatcher or John Major in such a situation. And it didn't happen. You know, that politician was inordinately polite and respectful and congratulatory of what the president had just been saying for his apparent honesty and so on. And I tell you, I just sat there, I was absolutely amazed. And I thought, well, if this is in any way typical of American politics, then you've really got hope, and you've got more hope than we have. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay. It was a little chink of light, and But let's think of this political thing. Of the two parties, or two main parties as far as we're concerned, obviously one, as we know, wants to favour business and the relatively well-off. The other wants to look after, quote, the common man. Well, neither of those is essentially bad, except, of course, for the fact that each tends to strive for its aims without apparently caring for the other side's interests, and sometimes apparently even wanting to harm the other side. And that seems to me severe sub-optimization. There was, to me, a horrible case of this in the House of Commons 4 months, maybe less, three or 4 months ago, when Norman Lamont, a very immaculate Chancellor of the Exchequer, wearing an elegantly tailored suit, backed by his very substantial salary and even more substantial private income, stood there and came straight out with, well, it's hard luck about what's happening nowadays, but of course we all appreciate that the rapidly rising figure of unemployment is well worth it in order to get inflation under control. Well, it might have been worth it to him, but the increasing millions who were losing their jobs, I think it might have sounded a rather cruel comment. Mind you, with the election coming up at the very latest next May, and the Conservatives not really quite being able to get the economy right, as they keep putting it, in time for that election, well, because certainly the unemployment thing is still going up and up and up. Maybe Norman Lamont will eat his words. But I don't want to be party political here. Look at the other side. There was a case, I think it was 2 elections ago, when Dennis Healey, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, with great pride announced that the Labour government would make the rich scream with anguish. Did you get that one reported over here? I don't want to. But I mean, the point is that this is all about competition, conflict, sub-optimization to a huge extent. And obviously that really affects just about everything which happens. Of course, this is the government. This is the government which is affecting us. Now, if in opposition to that political fetish of competition and conflict, what I would like to tell you a couple of personal examples, as it were, on the other side. On the side of how cooperation win-win can really be of enormous benefit. Personal examples, both of them. First one, short one, is a musical example. Now, Dr. Deming, as you know, is quite fond of illustrating with musical examples. There are two in the system of profound knowledge. He first talks about a string quartet in terms of a system. And this morning he mentioned a full orchestra, similarly, in terms of a system. Now, before Dr. Deming entered my life, if I can put it like that, I used to have some spare time. I had time for hobbies. And my main hobby really was, or main hobbies were in the musical field. I did a lot of music. In particular, from about the end of the 1960s until about 1985, I was always director of music of one or more amateur operatic societies, say, in the area. And I well recall what happened in the very last society which I was involved with, as I said before Dr. Deming entered my life. It was a Gilbert and Sullivan Society in Nottingham, where I've lived for many years. And I got appointed here as musical director, and people started talking to me before I turned up, and they said, "You're going to be in real trouble here, because this society has a history of real huge conflict between musical directors and producers." Pretty obvious why. I mean, producers like to have, really exotic choreography and so on, lots of movement on stage for good visual effect. And musical directors, of course, don't like that because you can't really sing very well while you're prancing about the stage. And, apparently things had been really bad between previous producers and musical directors. Well, I was glad of the warning. I'd come across the problem before. And so I got to know who the producer was for the next show. It was Yeoman of the Guard, which we were doing, Yeoman of the Guard. And we met, and we had 2 or 3 evenings together, started discussing a whole approach to things, then got down to the show in particular. And I just remember one glorious moment, and it's absolutely true. We were getting on pretty well, but this particular evening, the level of argument was increasing. We were really beginning to shout at each other about various things. Then all of a sudden, we both realized what we were doing, and we just stopped, and we started just virtually rolling around the floor with laughter. Because what had happened was that I had got to the stage of really looking at things so much from his point of view that I was arguing for more stage movement and choreography and so on. And he was really having so much attention to music, he was trying to cut down on that for the benefit of the singing. And we just sort of realized that that was happening just at the same moment, and it was then pretty obvious that cooperation win-win and optimization of that system had gone a pretty long way. And it was an extremely successful working relationship, and the show turned out pretty good. The other story I'd like to tell you is a little more recent, and it's to do with my book, which John was kind enough to mention just before I started. It's published by SPC Press, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about why it was published by SPC Press. When the BDA came into existence at the end of 1987, one of our objectives was to start stocking important books and other resources which were pretty much unavailable in Britain at the time. And we wrote round to publishers, telling them our aims and intentions, also say we were pretty poor and any kind of consideration they could give on the way of commission and so on would be kind of acceptable. And SPC Press responded very favourably to that, and they weren't the only ones, but they certainly responded far more favourably than anybody else. And they gave us a commission rate which really must have left them a pretty tiny profit margin, and that kind of stuck in my mind. About 18 months later, then I started thinking of writing a book. And obviously that fact had stuck in my mind. I had no idea whether SBC Press even published books by anybody except Don Wheeler, who was the husband of the head of the company. But I thought, well, if they're going to be that kind of nice, then they might be pretty good people to deal with. And that was essentially why I approached them in the first place. I approached them initially with what might not have been a particularly attractive proposition relative to the way the thing turned out. I was thinking in terms of a short monograph, a sort of update on some of Dr. Deming's thinking since he had written Out of the Crisis. And I put that proposal to them and they accepted it. About 3 months afterwards, of course, it was no longer a 100-page monograph, it was about a 450-page full comprehensive introduction to Dr. Deming's work. But that's how the relationship started. And there's not only something to learn from the reason why I offered my book to SPC Press, there's a lot to learn from the way that we've worked together. For again, I think there's been a lot of cooperation, win-win, leading to optimization of a system which I have certainly not known with any previous publisher that I have worked with. First of all, Fran Wheeler, the head of the company, did a lot of good work improving my writing style. Quite pleasantly, I think, on a beach in Florida, I think she told me. But she did a great amount of rewriting my work, getting rid of my long sentences, getting rid of my absurdly long paragraphs in some cases, and really making it a lot more easy to read. But always making it clear to me that I, as the author, would have the last word. I mean, however good the relationship, you've got to have some kind of rules as to how to deal with disagreements. I can't remember any particular disagreements, but you need the rule. Second, I, as the author, who I must admit have been very largely ignored by my previous publishers as soon as I'd handed my material over, I was invited to contribute my thoughts to virtually every aspect of the publishing process. Page size, font style, font size, layout of the pages, cover design, the lot. Of course, naturally, they were the experts here, so I guess without it even being said, I accepted that they would have the final say if I came up with anything too ludicrous on that side. And I don't think I did. I did come up with one thing which startled them. I suggested they make it a hardback book. Didn't realize they'd never published a hardback book before, but they agreed to that. Now, what I'm getting at, do you see the parallel between that relationship between an author and a publisher and what I was just saying 5 minutes ago about a relationship between a musical director and a producer? I think there's quite a lot to learn from that. Seems to me this is a pretty good way to do business, with mutual respect, without private turf, with understanding on how to resolve disagreements, and then hopefully to have next to none. I'll tell you also that the feeling of joy and fun in work in that little publishing company is exceptional. And I know because, again, unlike what happens with most authors and publishers, I spent a lot of time actually in their offices. And let me tell you one final aspect of the story. At the dinner organized by SPC Press last year, exactly on this Monday night of this conference here in Cincinnati last year, there was a sort of celebration launch dinner for my book. And one of the guests was Bill Schirkenbach, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing way back since 1985. Bill told me he was writing a new book. Well, both in my speech and in private conversation with Bill, as you can probably guess, I had nice things to say about my publishers. And I recommended that Bill place his new book with them. Well, he's done so. And tonight, SPC Press is holding another launch party, and this time, of course, it is for Bill's new book. Now, I wasn't much of a name for SPC Press to take on board. Bill Schirkenbach is, and I believe that SPC Press is on its way from being a rather sort of small fry publishing organization to a recognized specialist for books directly related to the Deming philosophy. And I'm delighted to have been part of that development and perhaps to have influenced more of it. The lesson from that, think back. If Fran hadn't been kind of generous to the BDA back at the end of 1987, it's highly likely I'd never even thought of offering my book to him in the first place. Now, when she made that offer, was she envisaging the sort of possible spin-off? Well, maybe not. I think she'd have a pretty good crystal ball to see exactly what's happened from that, if she was really just sort of doing it with that in view. Well, it seems to me to be a great example in support of optimization of systems, cooperation, unselfishness, and lack of short-term considerations. I'm not quoting this example to sort of prove that unselfishness works. Certainly proves it can work, and work very well. But I know that, you see, we know that we can always find examples to support any argument. That's why Dr. Deming teaches us not to depend on examples. Certainly not as things to copy. He does indeed use examples very much himself, and it is good to do so to sort of illustrate theory, to put flesh on the bones of theory. But examples can't prove a theory. They aid understanding. And I think that this example, to me, does aid understanding of what cooperation win-win can really do to help optimization of a system. What about SPC Press? Did Fran make that offer to the BDA then back in 1987 for entirely altruistic reasons? Well, I haven't embarrassed her by asking it. But knowing as I do now, I'm sure there was at least a pretty good ration of altruism there. If you want to look at the story from the more hard-nosed point of view, well, that's fine. Dr. Deming touched on this morning. He talked about selfishness. One could perhaps advance the theory that there's never any entire unselfishness. Well, maybe. If necessary, let's have everybody being unselfish for selfish reasons. At least that's better than not being unselfish at all. Well, these examples, both that one and the musical one, I think have illustrated situations where unselfishness and cooperation have helped optimization of the system. But let's be careful. We know that generous actions do not always have desirable results. Indeed, we know that selfishness, competition, short-termism, management by fear, management by results, just about any of the things which Dr. Deming speaks against seem to serve some people very nicely indeed. The write-up also includes some examples of where some, if I can put it this way, some very non-Deming things appear to have been absolutely essential steps along the road to optimization. I've had to cut those out because of time, but they're there in the write-up. Now, how should we think about that? It's very difficult, especially for a group of people like us who are deeply committed to Dr. Deming's teachings to deal with such questions. Well, surely we need to if we're going to have any credibility with those who haven't yet reached much of a level of understanding and acceptance of Dr. Deming's work. Seems to me that although Dr. Deming spoke explicitly in terms of optimization of the system a little less when I first heard him in the mid-80s than he does now, that surely, in fact, is where he has always been. He's working on getting to the very best situation that can be envisaged. Optimization, what is necessary to get the very best out of the system. But you see, in most instances, that's a long way off. I talked earlier in terms of a journey. I mean, nearing optimization of the system is, if you like, nearing the end of a particular journey. But I think what we must be careful to see is that what is good near the end of a journey is not necessarily good for the beginning of the journey. It may be, but it ain't necessarily so. Climbing techniques, for example, near the bottom of Mount Everest, are a bit different from the climbing techniques which you need near the summit. And if I develop that analogy a bit further, if our objective is to climb Mount Everest, and we're at the moment halfway up a different mountain, we've actually got to go down first before we can even get to start climbing Mount Everest. In other words, go in the opposite direction, down instead of up, to what we want to the direction that we want to go. Dr. Deming spoke this morning of profound knowledge as providing a roadmap for the journey. But a roadmap only helps you plan the journey. It doesn't map out the route for you. And again, the territory near the end of the journey may be very different from what you encounter earlier on. Different driving techniques may be appropriate on different kinds of roads. Now, of course, me coming from Britain with the state of roads in that country, that analogy probably means more to me than it does to you, but I think you can see what I'm getting at. The point is that I would take Deming's warning, there's no instant pudding, there's no recipe as to what to do, what route to go, perhaps one stage further than is normally done. So, let me start summarizing some of the things I've been saying. An obvious lesson, I think, from these various illustrations, and I want to emphasize this, because it doesn't seem to be emphasized very often, but I think it's important, is that what is needed at an early stage of the journey to optimization may be very different from what is needed later on. And some of those early steps may well be quite opposite to Dr. Deming's teaching. To me, his emphasis on optimization of a system of late, that's what's come through to me and has helped resolve some of the paradoxes which I used to see. Early parts of journeys, therefore, may still for a long time have to contain and retain faulty practices rather than better practices. When the situation that we're in is at the opposite end of the spectrum from optimization, some sub-optimization may well be necessary on a temporary basis in order to prepare the ground for the big part of the journey. Beware of doing something sort of blindly just because, quote, Deming says so. He doesn't want us to do that. He is thinking of optimization. And when you're a million miles away from optimization, the same messages might not yet be relevant. I'm a little concerned by what I've heard from time to time recently about trying to encourage people to perhaps rush in where we might say where angels would fear to tread, even on some of the big topics like performance appraisal, merit systems, and so on. Just go ahead and get stuck in and do it. I think it's dangerous. You see, that kind of advice reminds me of a story which Dr. Deming used to tell a lot, and that's about a poor old manager from Ford Motor Company who went to a 4-day seminar sometime in the early 80s, heard the third of the 14 points, you all know what that is, and went back to his plant the next Monday and fired all his inspectors. Now, that is obviously not a too sensible thing to do, and I know of examples back home. I know of examples where people have fallen into the same trap, where they have taken some specific advice from Dr. Deming, isolated piece of advice, not seeing it as part of a bigger system, and because they've thought that they're then doing what Dr. Deming wants them to do, have plunged in on that and have really come a cropper and have finished up worse than they began. And that harks back to something Peter said in his presentation. Those of you who have been to a Deming seminar very recently will have seen, I guess, I think they've been attending, most of them, some of those wonderful people from Gallery Furniture down in Houston. And the argument for sort of going in and doing something pretty drastic, moving in the Deming direction, they have been cited very often. They're a small furniture retail company that in April this year abolished commission on sales and went to salary. And they did this after attending a number of Deming seminars and repeatedly asking Dr. Deming and Ed Baker and maybe some other people, what they should do about this commission thing, because they had realized by then it was wrong. And the advice was, yeah, go ahead and do it. And that was good advice. That was the right advice in that kind of circumstance, because Gallery Furniture were already doing so many of the right things. And of course, when you're moving along the road to optimization, at some place along that road will come the right time to really take some big, big steps. But to take them too early can make matters worse. And as I say, I have some sad examples from back home that I didn't know about when they were happening, but I sort of got the flack afterwards because people, had heard of some of Dr. Deming's messages from me. I hadn't made the system thing strong enough by then, and it caused them some trouble. And I fully confess that I made some bad mistakes on that. Let me finally touch upon some really difficult issues. Some of Dr. Deming's teachings are regarded with, to put it mildly, a certain amount of doubt by many, including people who subscribe to a vast amount of what he says. Now, why should that be so? I think the explanation is, again, strongly connected with what I've just been saying. Let's think of two of the things which came from Dr. Deming's presentation this morning. First of all, his teaching on monopolies. Dr. Deming speaks in favor of monopolies. Well, of course he does. When you're moving towards optimization, anything other than monopolies is going to cause damage. Anything other than monopolies will produce duplication of effort, waste of resources. increased variation, often short-termism, cost-cutting, indeed all of the bad results of competition. But on the other hand, the world at large is against monopolies. Well, of course they are. This is an imperfect world. And in an imperfect world, there's a likelihood of monopolies taking unfair and unwise, in Dr. Deming's context, advantage of their position, providing poor service, high prices, bad value to their customers. Dr. Deming spoke this morning of the breaking up of AT&T's monopoly. Well, I'm obviously no expert on that. I certainly believe him in what he says. But I also know that British Telecom, when they were in a monopolistic position, took advantage of it. They got lazy. They went for extreme restrictive practices. They generally offered poor service, poor value to their customers. And I also know that they have sharpened up their act considerably. They've still got a heck of a long way to go since the rules got changed 2 or 3 years ago. Secondly, think of Dr. Deming's teaching on over-justification. He left us to read it this morning. He didn't actually talk about it. But he often speaks about the bad effects of tipping. He has offended people by attempting to tip them. I believe him. Of course he has. But you try not tipping porters in a hotel, or an airport, or taxi drivers, or waiters, waitresses. There's a difference, and it's a very important difference. In his position, he naturally commands an unusual amount of respect and human feeling. But in our present system, that's the exception rather than the rule. His relationship with people is much nearer optimization than is that of most of us. So again, what holds near optimization may be different, a long way away from optimization. I think there's an extra important lesson to learn from that example, because I think that it teaches us that a highly important part of the required transformation of management is the strengthening of human respect and human relationships. So, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not contradicting Dr. Deming. I'm trying to put the things perhaps in a more understandable form when people can see contradictions to what he's saying. I have no doubt whatsoever that along the road to transformation, along the road to optimization of the system, the time will come when monopolies will always do the right thing and when tipping will become an irrelevance. And I'd love for the world to develop like that while I'm still around to see it. But neither I nor anybody else, I think, can force it to come by taking action recklessly before its due time, by putting carts before horses, if I put it like that. I'd like to conclude with some words of comfort, if I can use that expression. Maybe this is more relevant to my people back home who are still much earlier in this journey than I guess many of you are, and it is certainly relevant to them. But if you are struggling right now with apparent contradictions between Deming's teachings and what seems to be necessary and effective in your current situation, people get depressed about that, but I'd say take heart. Take heart, but don't relax. Increase your own understanding and that of those around you on why faulty practices are indeed faulty. And do all that you can to move on that journey to optimization so that it becomes possible and wise to replace the faulty practices with better practices. Of course, it's not easy, especially since, you see, the faulty practices are part of the current system and are interacting with the rest of the system. If those interactions, if those interlinks are tremendously strong, it could be dangerous to suddenly go in and change a component there without really working out the likely results on the things which they are interlinked to. As I say, I have seen it happen. I have seen huge harm caused by people who've taken, say, a specific Deming point and have gone for that in something like isolation from the much larger and more profound message. It's not easy. Dr. Deming has never said that optimization of the system is easy. And I believe him in that too. It isn't easy. But he does teach us that it's possible, or at least to get close to it, which is all that's necessary. And it is necessary to make that transformation toward optimization. And I believe him in that also. And I think so must we all. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.